like to welcome Ask to the stage, Ask Agger from Denmark. Now, in my little notes, it says here, Ask is a storyteller. He said to me, don't say the rest, it's not interesting, but I think it is actually. A board game enthusiast. Oops, I've got my volumes gone on my thing, woohoo. Martial arts instructor. That's pretty impressive. I think I'll be nice to you. And the motto is, without sin, no redemption. I'm going to remember that and try that back home later this evening. Okay, so without further ado, Ask, over to you.
Thank you very much. So good to see you, and great to meet people, in person. I'm sure I'm going to have a little bit of social overload tonight, but that is highly appreciated. And also hello to all of you online for joining. Okay, so let me see if there is a slide coming up. There is, excellent. So yeah, my name is Ask. I come from Copenhagen. I'm heading a change agency called Workz, and I'm, my destiny is very linked to board games. I played games when I was a young nerd, and also to become part of my professional life later on. And the thing about board games is that it's something very deeply rooted in human culture. When they opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt, there were several board games inside. So, and the first board games about training, leadership, strategy, and so forth were designed years before the first books were written about the same subjects. So in many ways, the whole idea about using gamification and games as a way of training leadership skills and so on, it's not a new fad, it's not a new idea, it's where it all started out. So Workz is a specialized change agency with 25 people based in Copenhagen, but we work with corporate clients around the world, and our focus is in involvement, so the human side of change, and it's very much about making sure that when we hear about a new strategy or change project, it's not only the boss's strategy, but we have a shared ownership, and we also know how we can contribute and be part of the journey. And using games can be a great way of involving people. And we see these tools as a way of designing meaningful conversations. And this is also why that we, when it makes sense, like to meet in person, the old school way, face to face, no screens. Because when we have a conversation through screens, we tend to lose something. And of course, during the pandemic, we all did a lot of online involvement and so forth. And that worked better than I had expected, to be honest. But still, when we have the options, we like to bring people together. We like to be tactile. So using board gaming elements, using these kind of gaming tools as a way of having a shared language among the participants. So we do a lot of these game designs. We do a lot for bespoke clients, but also we do a lot of generic leadership games that are used, throughout the world. And when we started to do these kind of projects, we started out in Denmark and Scandinavia and so on. And we were very curious about, well, is this something that only connects to people, in Copenhagen or Denmark and so? But really has been so joyful to see that across all cultures, everybody likes to be involved. Everybody likes to play. And just this picture is one of our games called Wall Breakers, about how to lead change and handle resistance. And here you have people from Indonesia, China, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia enjoying the same game. And of course, building trust and how to facilitate, you have to be conscious about some cultural differences, but everybody likes to play. Everybody enjoys to be part of the conversations, to contribute, learn from colleagues and so forth. So this is where I come from. And the idea now is just to take a quick look into the back history of Workz series, games and so forth. Then a little bit of war story from old Prussia, and then look at just some example of how gamification can be used to accelerate change processes and so on. Okay, I'm going to go fairly fast, but I'm going to stay later today and tomorrow, so if you have any questions and so on, let me know. Okay, so the history of games go way back, and this might be the first example, the King Game of Ur. It's at the British Museum in London, but a very ancient game going perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 years back. Also, there's a rich traditions in using games in old India. This is a predecessor of chess called Chuchanga, I think, and there's many versions going back there. My personal favorite is from old China. I used to study political science and sociology, and my destiny, career-wise, was more or less to become a bureaucrat. And this is a training game more than 1,000 years old, helping people to overcome an important exam to become a bureaucrat at the court in China. So that's a bureaucrat training game that goes way back. And then, of course, there's the strong tradition within the military circles, so the Kriegsspiel of the Prussian army and so forth. And this is like a key inspiration also for the kind of games that we design today. And you also still have, a nice cooperation also with military services, learning from their experiences and so on. So just a little bit of the traditions that it's based on. So let's jump to a war story. Let us go back to 1806, the 14th of October, I think it was, outside the city of Jena in southern Prussia back then. And on that day, two armies were clashing together. A big Prussian army under command of Emperor Wilhelm III, and then the army of the young Napoleon from France. And going into that battle, the Prussians were fairly confident, because they had twice the number of troops, they had like very well-trained soldiers, very seasoned officers and so forth. And the French army they were meeting were very different. It was a mix of some veterans, but also a lot of young recruits. The uniforms didn't match, and especially many of Napoleon's officers were very young, like people in their 20s and 30s commanding their troops. So the Prussians were very confident. But the day didn't turn out so nice for them, because the French didn't do as they had expected. And when there were like opportunities on the battlefield, the rigid German military machine couldn't adapt to these kind of changes, couldn't explore the opportunities and so forth. So they saw but a huge military defeat. And I think the philosopher Goethe, he was a lecturer at the University of Jena back then, and he was like a witness to the battlefield. And for him, like the whole world fell to pieces when they were like defeated by the French. And later he wrote a book about the end of history and so forth. So a big military defeat. One of the young Prussian officers that was part of the battle was Clausewitz. And he became into captivity later on and had some good time in solitude to reflect, and later wrote a book called Bis Krieg. And I'm just going to share a few insights from him. And this was like the sparkle for the big reorganization of the whole Prussian military, and some good insights regarding how much we can lead, and turned into a very pragmatic approach to how to lead change and so forth. So I don't know, it's very hard for you to read it out, but this is just a very basic model that came out of it. And basically it's a model about getting stuff done. So here at the top we have what we want to achieve, so some target. Here we have our plans, and then how we act. So we want to do something, then we plan, and then we do stuff. It's a basic setup for getting stuff done. But what Clausewitz realized, and the Prussians back then, is that when you work in organizations with people, there is some friction. It's not that easy. And Clausewitz, he's also the author of the very famous quote regarding, well, you can do whatever planning you like, but when the first gun goes off, everything falls to pieces. So Clausewitz identified 3 gaps, and he called it friction. Today we might call it complexity instead. The first gap is the knowledge gap, and that's the difference between what we know about the world and how it really is. Because our insights are limited. We might expect the enemy to have 10,000 troops, but they might have 20 instead. We might expect to fight on a rainy or sunny day, but it might be raining. So we only have limited insights when we make the plans. Then when we start to execute, we might meet the alignment gap. And that might not be relevant in your organizations, but you might have heard about it. It's the difference between what is planned and what goes on. And there is some organizations where there is unplanned activities. There might even be stuff in plans that are not executed. Or when executed, it's done a little bit different way than was intended. So in organizations, we have, not the best of plans, but at least some plans, stuff that is happening, not always as planned. And that leads us to the third gap, the effect gap. And this is the difference between expected outcomes from actions and what really happens. Because when you do the planning, it's very hard to predict what will deliver results. We might expect that if you take this hilltop and fire at the enemy, they're going to surrender. But they might counterattack, or just are waiting out. It's hard to tell. So all in all, the combination of these 3 gaps, these 3 sources of friction, makes it very hard to execute in organizations. Before the defeat at Jena, the Prussian military back then, they tried to fix the gaps by going into details. So making very detailed plans, very detailed instructions, very detailed control. And one by one, that might make sense, but Clausewitz and his peers realized that in combination, they just contributed to the fiction, making it even hard to execute and succeed at the organization. So they implemented what's called an Austragstaktik, which was a very radically different approach to how to lead. It took them 40 years to reform the Prussian army. They built a new military academy in Potsdam and so forth, changed all the officers. And they implemented like a very, what you call like modern agile approach to leadership, being super pragmatic about how much you can predict, how much you can lead. And it's very much about really delegating to the people in the front line, about trusting them. And the key insight is that to really create results, it's not enough if you do what you're told to do. You need to do what needs to be done. And there's a big difference. And they even went so far that they said like, their officers, they had an obligation to disregard orders if they on the battlefield could see another opportunity was better. So it's very much about being, disloyal, but still in a loyal way. Okay? So some key insights from this. What I'd just like to share now is that how can games help us to address these three gaps? The first gap, the knowledge gap, is about how to navigate an unknown landscape, and especially looking into the future. And the way we normally approach this, I just need to get this, we make war rooms, or sometimes you also call them like industry simulations. But basically it's about open-ended games where you try stuff out, what if? And recently it has become solely relevant regarding the crisis in Ukraine and so forth, but we twice have done war room sessions regarding that crisis. Getting people together from different organizations in Denmark, from the military, foreign services and so on, and then try to explore, and then try to play it out. So these pictures is from, in fact, like I think 7 years back after the first crisis, but we did a similar session last month in Copenhagen. And the whole idea about sessions like this is that you cannot predict exactly how it's going to be, but you can get a good understanding of the complexities, the tipping points, different perspectives and so forth. And one of the key insights that games can bring is the opportunity to change perspective. It's really, trying to play, Putin, looking at the conflict, how he's seeing what NATO is doing from the other side, gives a lot of good reflections along the lines. And again, when we make a session like this, we bring together all the brightest people we can find, and it's not about them learning from the game, but having the game as a shared conversation where they can learn from each other. We also do a lot of these war rooms internally in organizations. This picture is from years back from a big French pharma company. But there, when they have to make like major acquisitions or R&D investments and so forth, then we can try to play it out. If we do this, what are competitors going to do? What are peers going to say? Try it out, testing it out. So this is about get a better knowledge of the landscape, that kind of complexity, and games can offer some good opportunities there. Then moving on to the alignment gap. And this is not about making strategies, but it's about making sure that we are really aligned where it matters. Not only understand like the nice strategy house on the PowerPoint, but really understand the dynamics of what it takes to execute the strategy and deliver results. And for this, we like to make strategy simulations. And this is not games about making strategy, but helping us really to understand how it all fits together and how different parts of the organization contribute. This picture is from Novo Nordisk, which is the largest Danish company, I guess, leader in the pharma industry. And for them, we help to design like a big setup where we look at the coming 5 years within the diabetes market, their major market. And this room was, I think, like the Chinese market. And at the same time, we had like 4 other rooms playing with the top 300 management team. And then they're like looking at the coming 5 years in the Japanese market, US market, and so forth. And in the game, they're not allowed to play themselves, but they played all the competitors. Pressure testing their own strategies from outside, looking at how to unfold it in different ways. And again, as a way of sharing knowledge, insights, and so forth, so when they have to go and implement, they're much better prepared. This example is from last year. We do a lot of work with ISS, which is like the global service management company, one of the biggest private employers in the world. They have like more than 400,000 people on staff. And because of the pandemic, we couldn't bring everybody together, all the top managers. So we created like a big virtual event where we had like 2 days of live streaming, like a television show, but then had like local watch parties. So here you see managers from, I think, 25 different locations getting together. And then combined with these like global broadcasts, they were like playing a strategy game about the One ISS strategy. And again, a way of having shared discussions, insights, but really learning about what is like the key dynamics of the strategy, what kind of decisions does it take to deliver, and so forth. And it was great fun trying to combine like the agile still being together with a virtual setup. And then finally, it's about the effect gap. So how to lead in the front line, how to try things out, how to probe, learn from feedback, outcomes, adapt, and so on. And for doing this, we like to work with leadership simulations. And for me, it's curious that when you look at the world of sports, if you have to do something important, like you're trained to win the Olympics, for instance, what are you going to do? You're going to prepare. You're going to do a lot of test matches, and so forth, making sure that you're in best shape when it really counts. But from my experience, that when we look at many big organizations, many corporations, how often do they have like a test match before rollout? How often do they get people together that, okay, now let's try to just play it out, see how it goes, learn from it, and then we're in better shape when it really counts? It happens very rarely, which means that on the big game day, we make a lot of stupid mistakes, mistakes we could avoid, and so forth. So, and the reason why I like to show this picture is that one of our clients and users of our games is the British sailing team, which is the most successful sailing team in the world. And they've been using one of our leadership games called Bridge Builders simply as a shared tool for internal discussions. So here you have like key people from like the training staff using the game to discuss how they can drive both alignment and autonomy and trust at the same time in the organizations. And if you're into sports, also the British national soccer team has used one of the games as part of their preparations for the World Championships. But the whole idea that we have to prepare, we have to train before it really counts. For me, it's so obvious that we need to do it, but we tend to forget. And then finally, the point about having a shared language. This is our Change Leadership Games Wall Breakers again. And in the game, the metaphor is that you are in charge of a bus, that's your department, going through a change process. Some of your colleagues are going to get frustrated, going to fall off the bus. And then it's about how to bring them back on the bus. And what we do often after playing the game, which is like a simulated case, then we say, okay, now let's use the game metaphors to talk about real life, your organizations. So this is for a big global logistics company. This is one team leader for a big digital change project. Try to map her situation. So she's the one game piece on front. Try to drag the whole project team, and her key stakeholders has already left the bus, waiting in resistance. And she used this to describe the situation for her peers. And then one of the participants was like, well, what about that piece? And this was like, well, that's kind of you. Okay, then we have to talk. So again, shared reference, giving some good insights about all this. I think my time is off, but hopefully could inspire a little bit. And of course, we can learn a lot from future technologies and AR and a lot of different elements, but also let's learn a little bit from history. And I think looking in the tradition of using game-based tools could be one good source of inspiration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ask. Wonderful.